Takes Mondays to make Fridays. 843-661-0937 is our number. We've got a we normally ramble about on Monday mornings, right, Rev? We normally make it up as we go.
True.
The week kind of writes itself. By noon Monday, Trump has done something that gets everybody's attention, good, bad, or indifferent. This is going to be a little bit different. A buddy of mine reached out to me. Henry actually called me several weeks back and said, you know, we're doing this big event. We want to get involved and promote it and talk a lot about it. I got three people in the studio. I introduced the three. Ben Zeigler, Henry Swink, and Stephen Motte are with us. Stephen's the curator of the Florence Museum. Henry is a proprietor at McCall Farms, a big sponsor of our feeble attempt at radio brilliance, but somebody very historically interested in our area, where we come from, what we're about, what we do. I refer to Ben as our resident historian, whether he likes that title or not. But Ben and I have had a friendship for a long time, but our friendship on this particular issue, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, in 2006, I got elected to county council in 2004. And in 2006, you came to me about heritage tourism, and you felt one of the attributes we had that we could most successfully market was Francis Marion. Henry has argued to me that other than General Washington, Marion would be the second most relevant general of the Revolutionary War era. You lobby the General Assembly. They create the Francis Marion Historical, or the Trail Commission, right. and out of that comes an attempt to commemorate and memorialize the life, history, and legacy of General Marion. Did I get that close to accurate?
You did, and really, thank you, Ken. It really did have sort of a several prongs to it. One was commemoration and memory and better historical understanding. But another thrust, as you pointed out, was using the Marion story as a way to leveraging it into what the tourism people call product. Finding the Marion sites, telling the Marion story, bringing people off the interstates into the back roads of the PD, helping drive some economic development, prosperity, along with conservation and preservation, marrying those two through a tourism trail that focused on campaigns of Francis Marion. So you're absolutely right. The late Bill Chandler and Fred Carter and I sort of put that together back in 2006. I chaired the commission for 3 years, and we did some great things. We did all the archaeology that we wanted to do to find most of the major Marion sites. Steve Smith at USC, who wound up writing a book that I commend to your listeners called Francis Marion, the Snows Island Community, Myth, History, and Archaeology. Steve did all the work. We were able to locate some fascinating Marion sites that we can talk about. And we had a master plan done by a national consultant that won an award, a historical planning award. And just about that time, the effects of the recession were kicking in, belts were tightening, heritage tourism ceased to be a priority for state government and ceased to be as appealing as it was in the early 2000s to local government. So the Trail Commission ultimately sort of went into hibernation by about 2010, 2011. Henry has injected a lot of energy into it lately. Henry was part of a group that helped push this exhibit at the museum, which is fascinating, and I look forward to talking with you about that. But Henry has almost single-handedly gotten the band back together, so to speak, with the Trail Commission. Henry's now a member, and he's been working with the governor and the General Assembly to jumpstart that effort to bring that heritage tourism trail, to bring the Francis Marion sites online into public attention, and hopefully reap some of the benefits that we were looking to.
Okay, Henry, I'm going to jump to you for a second. Yeah. So Ben gives you a lot of credit for rejuvenating, re-energizing. You're a Southern gentleman. I love to hear you tell stories. I love to hear you talk about your heritage, where we come from, your past, why it matters so much to you. So why now? I mean, why did you decide now to be as involved as you are?
Well, Ken, that's a great question. I'm not sure exactly why now. Certainly, Francis Marion and our local heritage has always been important in my whole life. I've always enjoyed it. Maybe, Ken, if we want to reflect, at my age, I've turned the company over to some younger folks in the business, family members in the business. They are doing a great job, so I'm looking for something to do. Certainly, that's probably part of it, but it's always been a keen interest, but I've had a lot of support. I'm in the Florence Kiwanis Club. I approached the club with this kind of thought in mind. They jumped wholeheartedly into agreeing that this is a good thing, a good project for our club to do. So I've had a terrific amount of help with the Florence Kiwanis Club. So they've been a big part of it too. But it's been a great journey so far.
Stephen, I want to go to you. You'd be, I don't know you as well as I know Henry or Ben, obviously, but you're the curator at the Florence Museum. There is a display that is available to the public or will be available to the public. So talk a little bit about putting this puzzle together. I mean, it's easy for Henry to want something done and me to want something done and Ben to want something done. There's got to be a venue. There's got to be an organized effort to make sure we do this the right way. How, I don't want to say how difficult, how complicated, how rewarding, how gratifying has it been?
Well, this has been a successful exhibition for us, I think partly because I am the curator of both art and history at the museum. And those things don't always connect or overlap, but there are some moments when they do. And Francis Marion is the story of the Revolutionary War in the PD. So in trying to tell that story, we have to talk about him. And there was a lot of interest in Marion in the early and mid 19th century. That interest came from literature, the biographies that were written about him, the stories that were told, that were picked up by these 19th century artists. There's a lot of material to draw from. And the purpose of the exhibition is to inform people about Marion and his significance through 19th century art, but also recent archaeology. And in doing so, compare the myth of Marion to the facts, the things that we can know about him through science, through archaeology and modern research. So it has been rewarding in the sense that this exhibition, I think, successfully pulls those things together for the first time. I mean, these artworks, they were from prominent 19th century American artists like John Blake White, who was also from South Carolina. The famous story of Francis Marion inviting a British officer to share his meal, known as the sweet potato dinner. This is a story that was told by Mason Locke Weems, that's early biographer of Marion's, and then it translates into art. First as illustrations in these early biographies, very crude, unattributed to any particular artist, but the stories and the images get picked up, and then art becomes a vehicle for the creation of the Marion myth. And for me, any subject of interest for an exhibition becomes more interesting when you don't have all the answers. The question in this case is, did these things that he became famous for in the PD, a lot of them, did they really happen, or are they part of a fantasy that was written about him, that was created and then perpetuated through the dissemination of art and literature in the early and mid-19th century? So
the intent of the exhibit is to make sure we're accurate. We're not embellishing. We're not exaggerating. I mean,
it's to show both sides of the story.
Okay.
Well, to promote conversation. I mean, no doubt we were talking before we came on the air. Marion took command of the Williamsburg militia at Witherspoon's Ferry, where the statue is, in what's now Johnsonville, Florence County, on August 17th, 1780. He had been sent away by Horatio Gates, who was the American general who had marched into South Carolina to liberate the state. The British had taken Charleston. South Carolina had fallen in May of 1780. Marion tries to hook up with Gates because Marion's evacuated from Charleston. He breaks his ankle, and that's a whole nother story. But he breaks his ankle before the city's captured, and he's evacuated. So he's not captured. He's a colonel in the Continental Army. He's the highest-ranking officer in the state once Charleston falls. And so once he recuperates in the summer of 1780, he gets a group of neighbors and like-minded friends to go and offer their services to Gates, who's just marched into South Carolina. Gates, in effect, laughs at him. It's this sort of ragged group of, we know it's described as about 20 men and boys, some black, some white, all miserably equipped. And so Gates you can almost see this great general. He's the hero of the Battle of Saratoga. He's the guy who's going to liberate South Carolina. He doesn't know what to do with this ugly little misfit, bow-legged, hook-nosed, short, swarthy, limping South Carolinian. So he sends him away to, quote unquote, gather intelligence. Gathering intelligence is to me, is sort of a euphemism for staying out of his way. He sends Marion to take command of the Williamsburg militia, which is a group that's gathered, and they've actually asked Gates to send them someone to command them. So Marion takes command of the Williamsburg militia. He rides out of the camp at Camden. They get about 12 miles down the road. They're awakened by gunfire, and they know a battle's getting ready to start. They question whether they're going to keep going or go back and join the fight. Marion says, no, we're under orders. We got to keep going. So they ride on. Unbeknownst to them, the American army is annihilated at the Battle of Camden. So when Marion rides into that camp on August 17th, he's it. There's nobody else with a viable fighting force in South Carolina. So between August of 1780 and April of 1781, when Nathaniel Greene comes into South Carolina to start the campaign that ultimately leads to Yorktown, Marion, that's his partisan career. That's his career, the partisan phase of his career. That's his career in the PD. That's where all of these famous stories and battles take place. Marion has a different role in the war after April of 1781, but we can say without doubt that Marion kept the cause of liberty alive. He fought with a band of citizen soldiers, very unlikely group to keep the great British Army off balance, but they did, and there's no question about that. What's more interesting to me, and what Stephen, I think, was alluding to, is the literature and the art then take that and try to leverage it into something more thematic, something bigger. And Weems starts in 1809. He's the most prominent publisher in the U.S. He's an Anglican clergyman, Episcopal clergyman, and his first great work is a biography of George Washington. That's the source of the myth of the cherry tree. And Peter Ory, Marion's lieutenant, good friend, writes a history of Marion's exploits, a biography of sorts, and sends it to Weems to be published. And Weems takes it and rewrites it and publishes it in 1809. Ory said that Weems turned his history into romance. I mean, even Ory recognizes that, look, this stuff didn't happen. But what Weems is trying to do is to create a national myth. He's trying to bring the states of the infant republic together. So he's creating these themes like George Washington. He calls Marion, to Henry's point, he calls Marion the Washington of the South, and sort of bringing the southern states into the conversation early in the republic when they're looking back on the Revolution. What was the war about in the South? So again, Steve Smith in his book says that when Southerners were traveling west to settle Alabama and Tennessee, Mississippi between the 18 teens and the 1830s, most of them carried two books with them, the Bible and Weems's Life of Marion. So that starts to create this idea of Marion that sort of transcends the actual historical record that we have. And I think I mentioned to you as well, contemporary accounts of Marion, particularly immediate post-war, he is not characterized as a great leader in the late 18th century sense. He's not a great general who wins big battles. You get the sense from Lord Cornwallis that he's more of a pest than anything. Bannister Tarleton, Marion's great adversary, doesn't even mention him in his memoirs. So, he's fighting a different kind of war than Washington, Cornwallis, and Greene are fighting.
But Ben, was he fighting that kind of war out of necessity?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I've heard him. Okay, and I'll give a characterization. I want to get your take on this. I've been led to believe through some of my readings and understandings that Marion may not deserve credit for winning the war, but he certainly deserves a lot of credit for not losing the war.
Absolutely.
Is that a fair assessment?
Steve Smith says he kept Steve Smith's whole thesis in his book on Marion is that Marion kept a community of resistance together. The people who live in our part of South Carolina, our people, our ancestors, Marion kept them on the American side and allowed them to fight, melt away into the swamps when it was time to do that, come back together. I mean, this is very much, as you and I said, this is the origins of partisan warfare. He wasn't out there to win big battles. He wasn't taking and occupying towns. He was keeping the British off balance, and B, perhaps more importantly, keeping this community of resistance together, keeping the American cause alive. Because you got to remember, people who lived up here before the Revolution, and there's a whole show you can do on this, it wasn't a clear-cut thing as to what side you were on. It's been compared. One loyalist of the period said that it was like a patchwork quilt. I mean, it was you had neighbors who were on different sides. It was truly a civil war, but there wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm in large areas of what's now the PD, what have been called the backcountry, for either side. And so Marion had to win some hearts and minds in addition to winning military objectives.
Let's take a break. First break of this hour. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Kind of a special edition of Wake Up Carolina. We're not doing the normal, rambunctiousness of conservative talk radio, but rather a more cerebral time with three gentlemen from this area. Henry Swink is a business guy here, been with McCall Farms. How long, Henry? I mean, the company's how old? It's
since the 50s.
Yeah, since the 1850s, right? I mean, I know you've been there.
1950s.
But the family's business is how old? I mean, it's
1838.
That's what I thought. Nearly 200 years old. I'm Stephen Motte, curator of Florence Museum. Ben Zeigler, are you the founding member of the Francis Marion Trail Commission?
I was the first chairman of the commission when it was created by the legislature in 2006.
And Henry is the current member, breathing some energy and life into this newest and latest effort. And Stephen, I want to go to you if you don't mind, and we'll get back to Ben here in a second. So so people want to know more. People wonder why they don't know more. You have an opportunity for people to learn more by visiting the Florence Museum. Fair?
Right. So Francis Marion, having grown up here, I'm from Florence. Having grown up here, Francis Marion was always a background character, right? And the stories that I heard growing up, businesses named after him, you learn about him going to school. And so I think because he was a recurring character in the background growing up in this area, we come to think of him as a sort of local hero, that he had this local significance that wasn't necessarily portable, that wasn't a national reputation. It was just a local reputation. So I think that was also true in those years or those first few decades after he died. He had a small reputation. And then his reputation grew, right? And art played a big role in that. These major American artists had decided to represent Marion as this heroic figure. And that is playing off of the literature and the biographies and the stories that were being told about him. And so in the middle of the 19th century, there's this huge swell of interest in Marion, and that's when his reputation as a hero really begins to develop. And so part of the purpose of the exhibition is to demonstrate that through art and through literature, Francis Marion wasn't just a local hero. He wasn't just a local story. He was very much a figure on the stage of national events.
Being the most historically significant figure of the PD, is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would think so. And in historically significant in terms of the history of our country, certainly Revolution, and I'd struggle to find somebody more significant. But I think the point that Stephen makes, and I'd like to read a quote from William Gilmore Sims's Life of Marion. We've got these three biographies of Marion that were published between 1809 and 1844, and they are really what bring together this sort of I don't want to call it the myth of Marion, but the idea of Marion, the ideal that people see in Marion, and the common understanding that people seek inspiration from in Marion. First is Weems, and he's a complete propagandist, hagiographer. He even Peter Ory, who was his quote unquote co-author, said, "Man, you've butchered my history." 1821, William Dobian James, who is a judge, who as a boy fought under Marion, writes a reminiscence, a sketch It's not very widely distributed, but it's considered to be very historically important because this is somebody who actually fought with Marion. So James is probably the most reliable historical account. And then in 1844, William Gilmore Simms, who's the first great Southern writer, first great fiction writer in the South, it'd sort of be like if John Grisham decided to write a biography of someone. I mean, it was a big deal. In 1844, Simms, who had written novels about the American Revolution, decided to write a biography of Marion, and he did a pretty good job. He, went to the sources that were available to him. He's a fiction writer, so there is some romanticization of Marion in his campaigns. He repeats a lot of the stories that become the subjects of the art and the mythology that we're talking about. But he grasps, I think, the dilemma pretty well. Let me read you a quote from his his biography that I think is significant. This is what he says. The fame of Marion rests very much upon tradition. There is little in the books to justify the strong and exciting relish with which the name is spoken and remembered throughout the country. In this respect, his reputation is like that of all other heroes of romantic history. It is a people's history, written in their hearts rather than in their books, which their books could not write, which would lose all its golden glow if subjected to the cold details of phlegmatic chronicles. So basically, he's saying, look, Marion, the history of Marion's not history. It's sort of history of an idea. And the idea that we see emerging in the art that's on display at the museum is this idea of Marion as the distinctly Southern hero of the Revolution. When you look at paintings like Marion crossing the PD, which is here from the Ammon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, absolutely spectacular. I mean, I get chills when I stand in front of it. John Blake White's Marion and Sweet Potato Dinner, and then another version of it that kind of helps tell the story by an unknown artist. William Washington's Marion at Birch's Mill, which is down near what's now Pamplico. These are all paintings that exemplify this ideal of Marion, but they exemplify what I like to call a defensive war. That Marion was fighting not to promote liberty, but to defend his homeland against an aggressor. And as we get into the 19th century and the South becomes wealthy through slavery, there's a real sense that we as Southerners are different. Our story is different. We're not out there trying to push ideals of liberty. We've got our own way of life, and it's been defended ever since the days of Francis Marion. So great comparison that's made in this exhibit between Marion's crossing the PD and the famous Washington crossing the Delaware. And Stephen, forgive me, the name of the artist?
Emanuel Leutz.
Emanuel Leutz paints Washington crossing the Delaware the year after Marion crossing the PD. But there are wonderful companion pieces, because when you look at Washington crossing the Delaware, there's Washington resplendent in his uniform. There's an American flag behind him. He's at the prow of the boat, and it's really got this sort of sense of carrying liberty, the fight for liberty and freedom, and all the sort of ideals that are wrapped up in the Revolution. Marion crossing the PD, as has been said, looks like a bunch of guys coming back from a deer drive. They're dogs and bugles, and you have to really look hard to find Marion in the middle of this crowd of frontiersmen. And it's got a sort of understatement and a sort of self-possession. It's not pushing any ideas. It's not pushing any ideological arguments. It's just representing this group of people, this group of backwoodsmen who were defending their home and hearth from an invader. And I think that's the sense when you get into the 1830s with the nullification controversy, abolition becomes more of an issue in the 1840s and 50s. Southerners were looking for someone that they could identify with historically and say, this is what we fought for. And indeed, during the secession movement, Marion is the spirit of Marion is invoked time and time again. So that's another way that story sort of played out. But
Stephen, I'm sorry. You continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to play off of the William Gilmore Simms quote. Francis Marion was legendary. Right. The title of the exhibition is Legend, Francis Marion in the PD. Now, the exhibition specifically focuses on that part of the Marion legend that occurred here. Francis Marion was well known in the Low Country because that's where he was from. He was well known in the Mid-State for his military campaigns there. But the core of the Marion myth, the Marion legend, happened here in this area in the PD, and that's really central to the theme of the exhibition.
And that's that partisan period between August of 1780 and April of 1781. After April of 1781, ironically, Marion partners up, one of the most unlikely partnerships in military history, with none other than Light Horse Harry Lee from Virginia, Robert E. Lee's father. And they proved to be a very compatible and very powerful team. And they, under orders from Nathaniel Greene, set about reducing British outposts in what we've now called the Midlands, Fort Watson, Fort Motte. Marion takes on a whole new role, and then ultimately Marion is in the last great battle in South Carolina, Eutaw Springs, later in 1781, fighting as a field commander under Greene. So the period we're interested in, and the period that resonates in our hearts and minds, is this partisan period. This is when Marion's fighting with the militia. This is when he's camped on Snow's Island. This is where all the great ideologically significant moments, be they real or imagined, in Marion's career take place.
But Ben, I understand the historical accuracy and the significance and the the artifacts and the paintings that you want to depict his life and career, I guess as a member of the military, in the weirdest way. But I want to ask both of you this, and I'm talking to Stephen and Ben, and Henry, jump in here if you'd like. To me, it's always been symbolic. He is an overachiever. He is an underdog. He is rebellious. I mean, I understand the historical accuracy or not. I understand what he was or not. But could Southerners be somewhat captivated by the symbolism of the consummate overachiever, the rebellious underdog? I mean, we Southerners have always kind of identified ourselves in that area.
I wouldn't at all call him an overachiever in that sense. I mean, he was indeed the underdog. Marion was also someone who very well knew his limits. Marion never put his men's lives at risk. He never, when he didn't have to, he was very cautious. He was very circumspect. He was very limited. He told Thomas Sumter, who was his fellow partisan commander and somebody that Marion despised, he told him, he said, you'd wade through rivers of blood to get a victory. Marion wasn't going to put these these were ordinary people. These weren't professional soldiers. These weren't people who had signed up for this, so to speak. They were fighting, again, to defend their home and hearth. So Marion was always very careful and very cautious, never would commit his troops unless he had a pretty good idea that he could win, because it wouldn't take but one battle for him to get knocked off. So he was a man who was very conscious of his limits. He was very humble, but he was also a man of great honor and personal integrity. And several of the paintings in the exhibit exemplify Marion at Birch's Mill, just down the road from your home in Pamplico, is a great.
The legend, especially as it is represented in these paintings, is less about Marion's military accomplishments as it is about his character. And in a couple of these paintings, like John Blake White's famous sweet potato dinner scene, Marion is in the center of the foreground. He's meant to be a central figure.
So we have a misunderstanding? I mean, when I perceive the symbolism of Marion to be the ultimate contrarian and the rebellious outsider, and I mean, have I missed it? I mean, is that the essence of Marion?
The legend certainly persists.
Yeah, no, he was very much. I mean, Marion didn't want to be where he was. I mean, he enlisted in the Continental Army.
But who would? In all honesty, who would?
He enlisted in the Continental Army in 1775. Fought at the Battle of Fort Moultrie. Was a colonel in the Continental Army throughout South Carolina, Battle of Savannah, Battle of Siege of Charleston, and he wanted to have a traditional military career. He didn't want to be some backwoods partisan, but that was what was required of him. That was so great. I think Stephen's absolutely right. When you look at the sweet potato dinner, of course, the sweet potato dinner, interestingly enough, throughout its history, it's painted, it's copied.
Hold on to that. I don't want to get you. We got to take a break. We got to pay some bills, but I want to come back and touch on the sweet potato dinner. We'll take a break. Baked sweet potato. We'll take a break. We'll be back in just a second. This is one of these short sessions because we've got more bills to pay. This is commercial radio. The only way we stay on the air is to generate some sense of profit. But I want to go back to something, and I'll let either one of you three. I won't pose the question to one individually. I'll let the three of you kind of answer accordingly. I think most of us understand, those of us who have dedicated some degree of interest in Marion, we understand how heroic his efforts were. Stephen, I'll start with you. I think we fail to understand. You were talking about the ethics and decency and morality of the leadership he exuded. I mean, kind of speak to that for a second.
Yeah, so Marion led by example, and I think this is picked up a lot in the artworks, right, in the paintings that are in this exhibition, specifically in the sweet potato dinner scene, right, which is basically the story is that Marion invites this British officer into his secret camp at Snow's Island. He leads him in with a blindfold. He comes into the camp. And then Marion, although he is a savage, right, who's living out in the wilderness, his men don't even wear uniforms. They don't fight formal warfare. They're engaging with the British in these sneak attacks in their camps at night. So Marion is seen as this savage, right? But in these artworks and in these stories that are told about him, he is also a gentleman. There's a sense of propriety. There's a decency of his character. So when we talk about the sweet potato dinner scene, I think that's really the significance there. We're talking about Francis Marion as this, he doesn't lose his sense of decorum, especially when you compare him to some other figures on the British side, like Captain Butler and the Burgess Mill scene.
So the story, to pick up on what Stephen was saying, the story is this British officer comes into Marion's camp to negotiate a prisoner exchange. He's blindfolded, taken on to Snow's Island. Of course, Snow's Island is so evocative. It's Marion's lair. It's his Athelney. It's the
Sherwood Forest,
great safe place for his fighting force. So this British officer comes in. They negotiate prisoner exchange. Marion says, "Won't you stay for dinner?" And he said, "Okay." And Marion leads him over to dinner, which is laid out in the stories. It's laid out on a pine log. In the John Blake White painting, it's on a table. In the John Blake White painting, and I'll let Stephen, the art expert, talk about this, but it's really interesting. It's a very formal tableau with the Marion and British officer standing around the table. It's almost got this sort of sacral or Eucharistic appearance to it, like they're about to share some sacred meal. But the meal is sweet potatoes and water. Sweet potatoes cooked in the ashes of the fire and water. And the story is that the British officer was so impressed that these men were living in the swamp without proper clothes and fighting, as Henry points out, with very little support, that he goes back to Georgetown and resigns his commission. He says, you can't fight against people who are that dedicated. Now, that's, interestingly enough, that's kind of an old trope. Those who would have read that in the 19th century, if you were educated in the 19th century, you would have probably learned Latin and Greek, and in learning Greek, you would have read Plutarch, who was a Greek historian at the end of the first century BC. And Plutarch writes a lot about the Spartans, Greek city-state of Sparta. And the Spartans were the toughest of the tough. They were the great warriors. They were, slept on the ground, no blankets. They were just the most incredible fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. And they had this famous dish called the black broth that was made out of vinegar and pig's blood and offal that they lived on. And the sort of conventional wisdom, and this is repeated often in Plutarch, is you can't fight against these people because they're not scared to die. How do we know they're not scared to die? Because they eat this awful thing when they're fighting. Anybody who would live on that is obviously not afraid of death. So it's kind of an old trope that what you eat as a fighting force somehow says something about who you are. But that is used in the sweet potato story. That is leveraged into this idea of dedication, of loyalty, of steadfastness, of enduring privations in the interest not only of your home and hearth, but also of liberty. Now, the interesting thing, and this is one of those wonderful instances where the archaeology and the myth and the history all come together. When we were doing the archaeological work for the Trail Commission, Steve Smith, obviously finding Snow's Island is a big deal. If we could ever find that camp on Snow's Island, it would be the Holy Grail. So Steve Smith, in 2006, 2007, spent a lot of time doing archaeological testing around Snow's Island, was not able to find the camp on Snow's Island, but on the other side of the PD River, on the north side of the river, a place called Dunham's Bluff, we were able to confirm an earthwork there that was known as Marion's Redoubt, was actually from the Revolutionary War, and then we found a camp around it. late 18th century militia camp. Clearly, it's a Francis Marion camp. That's probably the greatest thing that was discovered in the Francis Marion Trail Commission work. And we're pretty sure that camp guarded the approach to Snows Island. If you want to get over to Snows Island from the north or the east side of the PD River, you had to come through there. The east side of the PD River was much more loyal to the king. So if they were going to get attacked, it was going to be from what's now Marion County, and Horry County was Tory country during the Revolution. So we were excited about finding this camp. And in the camp, we found trash pits called middens. And in those middens were, everything from gun parts to animal bones. And not only did we find horse bones, cow bones, pig bones, we found deer bones, turkey bones, fish bones, and oyster shells. So not only were Marion and his men not eating sweet potatoes, but they were, having oyster roasts around the fire when a bag of oysters could be brought up from Georgetown, which makes good sense. In the winter months, you can put oysters in a bag and put them on a barge or put them on the pommel of your horse and carry them. So those of us who grew up in the PD and who've hunted and fished in the PD know that you're not just going to eat sweet potatoes in the PD swamp. You're always going to find some critter or fish to eat. And that was indeed the case, that the sweet potato story is apocryphal. It's meant to symbolize Marion's.
Okay, hold on to that. If these guys can stay, I'm going to convince them I'll have to pay them a little more money. We'll get them to stay for one more segment. I want to go down the how you can find out more. Take a break, back in a few. 843-6610. I don't know why I'm giving the number. We're not taking calls. We've got some distinguished guests with us this morning. There's very few times that we use the word distinguished and Wake Up Carolina in the same sentence. Ben, I've aggravated Ben and Henry for a while. Didn't know Stephen until today, but I've aggravated them a while to let's do a podcast together about Francis Marion. I've always suspected he's one of the most consequential figures politically, culturally, societally in South Carolina history, particularly in the PD region's history. So Ben texted me, I think Friday, and said, we think we can do something sooner than later. We got together. Henry and Stephen made themselves available, and for the last hour, we've talked about the life and legacy of General Francis Marion, talked about the Francis Marion Trail Commission, it being created by the General Assembly. Ben, I'll go to you for a second, then I'll go to Stephen. So has the General Assembly been, and because I want to help if I can, has the General Assembly been as supportive of exploring every avenue of heritage tourism in the Francis Marion? Are there things they can do to help us be more successful? Not in marketing, that's a cheesy way to say it, making known how important Marion was.
Yeah, well, certainly in the early years of the Trail Commission, the General Assembly and Senator Leatherman were very supportive, and we were well funded and got a lot of work done. Again, that sort of petered out during the recession. I think we're doing better in terms of the economy and tax revenues, and I know Henry's work with Governor McMaster is hugely supportive of these types of initiatives, and this one in particular. So I know Henry has been working with Governor McMaster to try to get some more funding, but I think the opportunity's there. I think the interest and the inclination is there on the part of our General Assembly and our elected leaders in general. I think you just got to have a way to funnel that. I think what Henry is doing and Fred Carter and others to bring the Trail Commission back is a good way to sort of funnel some of that. Now, the SC 225, the 225th anniversary of the Revolutionary War in South Carolina, that's been well funded. Their grants. We're now waiting on a $70,000 grant that the Archaeological Institute of the PD has applied for to excavate what could be some spectacular Revolutionary War related sites off the old River Road near Pamplico that could have been burned by one of the more consequential figures in the Revolution in the PD, a guy named James Wemyss, or Weems. It's Wemyss. He was a British officer who was sent from King Street to Cheraw. He marched 70 miles and burned everything within a 15-mile wide path. He was specifically sent when Marion got everybody stirred up in late summer of 1780. He was sent to put down the rebellion in the PD. So Marion retreats, goes up into North Carolina for a little while to get out. He couldn't take on a whole British regiment, so they disappeared. This fellow Weems marches up to Cheraw and burns every building between King Street and Cheraw. Notoriously hangs a ferryman from what's now Florence County named Adam Cusack. Did more to turn people to the American cause in the PD than probably Marion did. So we may have a Weems-related burned site. It's also a site that archaeological testing has shown has a strong African-American component based on the artifacts that came from the testing. So we're waiting to hear from the SC 225 committee to see if we'll get the money to excavate this, fully excavate the site. It could wind up being a major tourist attraction. So the money's available. I think the spirit's willing, but we just need a good way to funnel it.
And Stephen, the museum obviously is on board with articulating this version of history.
Yeah, of course. So this exhibition is going to be up until the middle of August. But we have a permanent historical exhibition upstairs where we interpret the Marion story. The benefit of the exhibition is that we can focus in on a particular theme and we can expand the story, and we can use all these artifacts that have been recovered in the archaeology along with these artworks that are on loan from major national art institutions to, it's not going to be here forever. But it's an excellent way to look at Marion from this particular angle of myth and legend. So, even if you're not an archaeologist, then I think this exhibition will attract you with the art. And if if art appreciation isn't necessarily your forte, then the archaeology certainly holds enough interest. And both of those things serve to tell both sides of the story.
And Henry, the Trail Commission is kind of an apparatus that promotes and makes more people aware of what Ben and Stephen are involved in. You've obviously become intimately involved in it. How can others help you? I mean, if there's somebody out there who wants to make a contribution, wants to be more involved, wants to be helpful in whatever way, shape, or form, I mean, how do they do that?
Well, they can obviously give money, but just as important, just use it. There's 16 sites on this Trail Commission of significance that we've talked about this morning. And just going by to see those sites, they are being updated right now. We're putting out an app on your phone that as you go up to these these sites, or as you're riding to one site to the other, you can learn about some of the things that Francis Marion did and what made those sites significant. There's a terrific amount of information out there for the public. I think using it would be a very good thing to do. But money is always important because it does take money, and the state is very supportive, but there's always additional monies that you really need. And Francis Marion's archaeological, to find those sites and verify them does take time and money, and Ben has been very diligent in doing that.
Ben, when I go to a Springsteen concert, I know I'm hearing Thunder Road and Born to Run.
Right.
I don't know what else I'm hearing, but I know I'm hearing those two. When I went to my buddy's 60th birthday Saturday in Charleston, I knew there were going to be 3 or 4 stories told.
Right.
I didn't know the others, but I knew 3 or 4 that we always repeat. Probably get nauseum repeating these stories. What are the 3 or 4 stories that you want to make people most aware of about the life of Francis Marion?
Well, I'll tell you another one that's represented. It's a Florence, what's now Florence County story that's represented in a painting, a study of which is in the exhibit. We don't have the full painting, and I'll tell you about that. But one of the paintings in the exhibit is a study for a painting done by an artist named William Washington called Marion at Birch's Mill. And as you know, Birch's Mill is on the PD River. I like to tell people it's behind the Delta Mills plant there near Pamplico, and it's a beautiful bluff over the river, and there was a ferry there, and there was a mill where you'd bring your corn to grind. There was probably a store. It was a significant settlement starting in as early as the 1740s. Marion was in and out of Birch's Mill a lot during the war. It's right there on the old river road. May have even been a little skirmish fought there, but Marion utilized the mill and the ferry a lot. At the end of the war, 1782, June of 1782, he camps at Birch's Mill for several weeks and sends out a proclamation. And this is historical fact. He sends out a proclamation to all the Tories east of the PD, and he says, come in, surrender, give your parole. I'll let you keep your firearms. I won't molest you, but you got to come swear that you're going to be loyal to the American cause and not fight against us. So over the course of several weeks, people are coming across the ferry and shuffling into the camp and giving their paroles. One day, a man named Captain Butler, a notorious, we're told, a notorious Tory, comes into camp, and Marion's men all kind of stiffen, and they pull him aside and say, "Hey, boss, we know what you said about not molesting anybody, but we got a thing with this fella, and we're going to take him out back if you don't mind." And Marion said, "Absolutely not. I've given my word that he will not be molested. I will protect him personally. If you want him, you got to come through me."
But he had supposedly killed some surrendered soldiers in what was called the Lynch's Creek Massacre.
Yeah. So Marion stands up for this guy against his own men because that he'd given his word and he wasn't going to just summarily execute someone. That gets made into a painting by William Washington. It's a magnificent painting. It's as big as the wall behind you. And when my father was in the state Senate back in the late 60s, it came up for sale. And Dad got the Senate to buy it, and they hung it outside the Senate chamber because Marion was a member of the state Senate at the time. Not a lot of people don't know this, but Marion was elected to the state Senate at the end of the Revolution. So he's serving as a state senator and continuing to fight with his brigade. We asked that it be loaned to the exhibit. It would have been perfect, and the connection with Florence and all that sort of stuff. And we were told that the State House Commission doesn't loan artwork. So we were able to get the study for it, which is smaller, but it's still pretty powerful. But that's one of those examples, a story that's an example of Marion's integrity and his decency. And it appears, I think it only appears in one of the biographies. I think it only appears in Sims. It may appear in James. It doesn't appear in Weems's biography. But I like to think it's true because we know about that same time when the British are evacuating Charleston. They leave Charleston on December 14th, 1782. That's when the British finally left South Carolina for good. Marion gets orders. I can't remember who the superior officer was, but he gets a note saying, we have intelligence that the British soldiers are filling barrels with fresh water in the Cooper River to load on the ships to have fresh water for the voyage home. We think you should go and attack them. And Marion says, "I'm not going to do that." He said, I'd sooner protect them doing that than attack them. He said, "They're leaving. They're just trying to get what they need to get the hell out of here. I'm not going to go attack them." So it was that sort of thing is very similar to what you see in the Birch's Mill.
But is that the curiosity that a lot of us have? How could a man so vicious be so decent?
But he wasn't vicious. That's the thing. He was tenacious. He was a great fighter. He was a brilliant tactician.
He into guerrilla warfare?
I mean, he was into it because that's the only way he could fight.
But did it require a certain degree of viciousness? I mean, I understand your point.
Well, the piece I read you on the break from Light Horse Harry Lee, where he talks about how he was, not attractive, his visage was not pleasing, and his manners were not prepossessing. And he says he was quiet, humble, spoke very little. I mean, he was not a charismatic,
some out of control maniac with a burning desire to kill people.
Right. No, that's the opposite of Marion.
Stephen, how important is it from the museum's perspective that we, the people of the PD and the state in general, understand more about this story, and how does the museum help facilitate that understanding?
Well, I think it's important that we understand the facts of anything historical, right? And in Francis Marion's case, it's important because, as I said, at the beginning of the interview, he was a background character throughout my life, and I think that it's that way for a lot of people. They're familiar with him, but they don't know the details. This exhibition and the work that we do at the museum to tell and interpret the Marion story, that's the public's chance to come and learn the truth about Francis Marion. What's interesting to me about him is that, he was certainly significant enough that these artists took it upon themselves to focus on him and his story as a facet of American history. And anytime the museum can put our local stories into the larger context, I think that's when those real educational opportunities happen.
And being in the story in general, one of the most consequential figures in early American history is from here. I mean,
Yeah, well,
I don't want to make it that sound that simple, but
and consequential both in his deeds and what he represented and what he came to be seen to represent. I put it simply to people, for 25 years we've been sawing this log of Francis Marion, promoting the Francis Marion story through some of these initiatives. And one of the sort of simple ways I put it to people is that by 1780, there was a stalemate in the Northeast. All the great battles, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, all those battles have been fought, and there was a stalemate. And so the only way that the British could win the war was by taking the South. When Marion came on the scene in 1780, the British were inches from taking South Carolina. And I think the argument is, if the British had taken South Carolina, had consolidated their hold in South Carolina, the war would have been over in favor of the British. What largely kept them from consolidating that hold was Francis Marion. So if Francis Marion hadn't been doing what he was doing between August of 1780 and April of 1781 in what's now the PD, we probably would have lost the Revolutionary War. I don't think too many historians can dispute that. They had us on the ropes, and Marion was able to give us a little bit of spring off those ropes through what he did.
And that's
We've talked a lot about these early biographies, but the Marion legend persists. There is what we know about him largely through the early biographies by Weems, by James, by Sims, and there were later biographies too. But there's also been some recent research. There's a book published about 8 years ago by a man named John Aller called Swamp Fox: How Francis Marion Saved the American Revolution. So there's certainly, we talk about the resurgence of interest in Marion through the Trail Commission, but he's out there in other people's thoughts and ideas and research as well.
And Henry, I guess keeping that fluid and alive is part of the Trail Commission.
And I think Ben's last statement about Francis Marion is the significance of him. That period of time, and the time this country was at a stalemate in the North, and their battle plan was to come up from the South.
Had us on the ropes, Henry.
Oh, absolutely. And he single-handedly did it. That's why he's so famous.
And to Ben's point, not with a bunch of trained soldiers, but rather a team of misfits.
No, and I've said this, down at the statue dedication when we first really started this was my late friend Bill Chandler and I had a little get-together for interested parties at Witherspoon's Ferry, what's now called Venner's Landing in Johnsonville, on August 17th, 2005. That was the what would that have been? That would have been the 225th anniversary of Marion taking command. That's right. Yeah, it was the anniversary of Marion taking command of the Williamsburg militia, and we had some speechifying, and everybody went to the VFW hut to have a few drinks afterwards. And one of the things I said, Bill Chandler told everybody to take their shoes off, that they were standing on holy ground. One of the things I said was that, we live in a world where we think everything that happens is the result of great forces, geopolitical forces that are driven by money and power and that sort of thing. And no one in 1780, if you'd ask a man on the street in London in 1780, would the British Army be in essence defeated by a bunch of people living in a place he'd never heard of. They never would have believed that. But I think it's a great sign that history can be changed by the most unlikely people in the most unlikely places, and that everything we do can have significance beyond what we understand.
The human spirit is timeless.
That's right. Well
said. Thanks to all three of you.
Yep.
We'll take a break. We'll download this on podcast format, right, Rev?
We'll publish it tomorrow morning.
Rev will have it up and running by 10. What do you call it? Produced?
Published.
Yeah, we'll have one published.
Polished.
Excuse me. Polished. It'll be a lot of polishing up.
I thought drop was.
No, that's my word. His is published.
Yeah.
I think you get paid more to publish than you do to drop one. We'll take a break. We'll be back in just a few moments. Want to thank our sponsors. Carolina Bank serves communities throughout northeastern South Carolina, offering a wide range of services to meet every personal or business need, from straightforward accounts to complex finances. They're prepared to help you reach your financial goals. Carolina Bank, banking on tradition since 1936. Member FDIC. Schofield's Ace Hardware, your one-stop shop for all hardware, paint and lawn and garden needs, plus all things sporting goods, including firearms, safes, clothing, footwear, and more. Pepsi of Florence represent the entire product line of PepsiCo, one of the world's leading food and beverage companies. Pepsi of Florence also serve brands from other great companies such as Dr. Pepper, Canada Dry, Lipton Tea, Gatorade, and various regional brands. Micky Finn's largest South Carolina liquor wholesaler, serving every county in the state, largest bourbon selection statewide. They ship wines to 43 states, opening soon a new beverage warehouse across from Buc-ee's on I-95 in Florence. They support USC athletics, including Williams-Brice and Colonial Life Arena. Marlboro PD Electric Co-op. If you're in big business and looking for an industrial park in the South to build your new plant, consider Marlboro PD Electric Co-op's new PD Commerce Center, an industrial park located at the I-95 exit in Florence, South Carolina. Check it out at MPDC Co-op or PDEC.com.